Hello and welcome back. My name is Greg, and we're working through part two of this hermeneutic journey. We've moved from text to image, and of course, that implies that we are also going to be looking at art in general. So, what is image trying to do that text and words cannot? We've talked about the logos. Okay? Not only does it replace mythos, but it also attempts to kind of reach upward, if you will, and communicate in the same way that the gods were thought to communicate, sort of with utter transparency and, ironically, with no interpretation at all, because everybody in that realm knew what everyone else was thinking completely transparently. And Hermes is, of course, the messenger of the gods and like figures. Okay. Well, this is precisely what art attempts to do as well. Okay? We're trying to imagine ourselves as being able to communicate in the way that the gods communicate, because after all of human conflict, okay, is centered around our inability to understand one another. Okay? That's sort of at the core of it. Yes, there's unequal access to resources. Yes, there's a few people who might get on an ego trip or have an addiction to power and its the use of power. But ultimately, these are people that we must come to understand as well. Indeed, crucially, we must do so. So we have all of these attempts, and hermeneutics is interwoven with text and image, with music, and with world, as we'll see later on. But the part two that we're working on here, of course, is image. So art is attempting to mimic or open up the space wherein a different kind of consciousness communicates with utter clarity, and thus the very idea that conflict can occur, can be kind of met head on in that way. So since language was itself not an exact enough description of how the gods communicated, and all language is contained in its essence in the rule of metaphor, this is from Paul Ricoeur, and thus its diaspora of meanings, precisely what was unnecessary amongst the divine. It is to art that we can turn, given its instant imagic quality, to represent and indeed perhaps even represents the transparency and immediacy of divine thought itself. Art does not originally hail from the other world, but nonetheless, it may travel there too. Today, we feel the same way about both myth and Godhead. Both are sourced in this world, the waking mundanity coupled with the unconscious reality of dreams. It is no surprise that the artist, who for the most part and up until the modern period was considered a particularly competent artisan, was, prior to our own time, imagined as a conduit for the other world's forces. Okay, think about the concept of the muse, for example. Rather like a saint, or before even this figure, a prophet. It is of interest to note another problem for hermeneutics, that once this or that faith became codified, exemplars thereof, such as the saint, replace the more radical pedagogic function of the mystagogue. Okay, this is a term from Max Weber. Once one has a code, there is no need for authentic prophecy. But art avoids this pitfall of routinization. Almost generationally in our own age, artists reconfigure the boundaries of what can be or could be understood as art. And there are always back reads to be had. Our earlier example of Turner is a well-known one, the Impressionist who predated Impressionism. As one can find in prophecy itself, here art shares a like discursive category with religion without sharing the same discursive space. This difference allows art to not only port itself as and as if transcendental, in this it is once again kindred with religion. To have faith is to know the divine, but from the mortal point of view. Art separates itself from any sense of institutional presence. As with other aspects of history, as a disciplinary discourse, this time it is within the scope of art history, as a study where we find the schools, institutions, movements, and the like. We take a similar view over to the theologian, who states that theology is the study of beliefs, wedded to the method of being able to believe in the first place. In the case of art, one need not at all actually be an artist to understand the power of art. I think this is a very crucial thing, right? For the Logos, in its transparency, one had to be a god to understand the other gods. But here, now, we have something that we have invented ourselves, we humans, where not all of us, indeed the vast majority of us, myself included, are not artists, okay, are not anywhere close to being artists, and yet we can still understand the power of art itself. This distinction, it's a crucial distinction between art and religion, even if we hold to the traditional view that the first imagery is very much associated with elements of a cosmology as well, and as well references ritual, as in sorcery backdropping a successful hunt. We talked about these ancient cave paintings, for instance, lies specifically along these most general lines. Faith is necessary to believe, yes, but mastery is unnecessary for understanding. I'll repeat that. Faith is necessary to believe. That part is old hat. But here we have another thing. Mastery is unnecessary for understanding. Given we have already seen that the methods of theology and aesthetics overlap, from the standpoint of the first, eschatology and exegesis appear as repurposed, though without necessarily a loss of either meaning or yet nobility. By this token, religious texts do not escape interpretation, as we noted above, nor does art seek to transcend it. Indeed, the hermeneutic agency within aesthetics has as one of its functions that very overcoming of cultural and temporal limits. We can observe a work of art from another age and culture and grasp some of its ineffable quality. How this does itself occur is very much the subject for the remainder of this second part of our work here. Just so, this is the moment where we can introduce our second form of hermeneutics, that of the historical or even of the historicist. This hermeneutics is associated with Wilhelm Dilthey, who first explored its range and depth, when in fact looking at who would become philosophically his most direct predecessor, none other than Schleiermacher himself. Without making such the focal moment here, we can simply remark that his acclaimed early biography of the key figure in Romantic hermeneutics, with its paean to the intentionality of the author and authority both, served as the motive for Dilthey to logically extend Schleiermacher's original move of generalizing the scope of hermeneutics in the first place. Recall that first move was to simply say that all texts have the same quality of relation to interpretation as does Scripture. Okay, so no longer is hermeneutics just to be associated with sacred texts. But Dilthey does something even more than this. He realized that all of history as well has this same quality, whether or not it was embodied in text proper. Hence, artifacts, structures, even diets and costume, tools, and the presence of certain kinds of domesticated animals could be read, akin to how one reads a text, even if some of the examples are less complex by their nature. Taken together, however, historical circumstance was to be the groundwork for the stanchion upon which historical consciousness might hang its hermeneutic hat. Given that the vast majority of what the historian considers is indeed text in any case, Dilthey's second extension of the scope of what is available for interpretation had an end, precisely along this line. Okay? Mostly historians are looking at other texts, but not exclusively, especially today. And beyond this, from early on in the agrarian period, we have writing on other kinds of objects than merely tablets. Script appears, of course, on pottery shards, fragments of stone and masonry, obelisks, glyphs, and frescoes, among others. The symbology of a culture is more apt to be represented in a kind of shorthand on surfaces or objects which are not meant to be vehicles for text as a whole. And just this week, there was news of a great extension or potential extension of the history of writing itself all the way back into our sibling species, the Neanderthals in Europe. Again, the same people who were painting the caves. It perhaps shouldn't be as surprising and shocking as it might seem to some that the Neanderthals also had a rudimentary coding system that was written down on bone tools and antler tools and things like that. So this is actually real news. This is the cutting edge of the history of writing, if you will. So just we can sort of put that to the side for a moment, but the point remains the same. Okay? The symbology of a culture is more apt to be represented in a kind of shorthand on surfaces or objects which are not meant to be vehicles for text as a whole. Akin with our contemporary logo, such symbols as glyphic pictographs involve us once again in an interpretative process. We observe a holism of meaning. Such a textuality is a gestalt. Its whole, at the very least, suggests something greater than the sum of the parts involved in configuring it. An easy example, the Christian cross or crucifix, is a later example from the same historical period and is a paragon case of this Gestaltkreis, or circle of the wholeness of meaning. It is this very intensity of meaning brought together in a singular mark as mark, M-A-R-Q-U-E, that leads us directly to the power of art as an image. Not that the work of art, at least as an aesthetic object, is a mere logo, right? When we think about logos, we think about the multicolored apple for the computer company. We think about the Ferrari logo, which is a famous brand. We might think about the so-called swoosh, the Athena Nike, the winged victory sort of symbol. All of these are kind of distilled, if you will, and none of them are really considered to be pieces of art. Even so, there is this point that they are gestalts. They bring together a number of other meanings to create something greater in the whole than the sum of their parts. Okay, so rather, this art participates on the one hand as an effort to duplicate the native ability of the Logos, and on the other, the effect of having a faith, its aspiration to ascension and thence transcendence. Art's success at becoming the synthetic term for the dialectic of the two aspects of cosmology, right? The Logos as the divine absence of interpretation. Remember, everything is totally transparent to the gods. They have no need to sort of figure out what the next god means by this or that, right? They have this transparency of communication. And the credo as the mortal sustenance for interpretation. We're in a completely different boat here. We need to practice interpretation. It's one of the reasons why I'm doing this series in the first place, is that this is the crucial crucible of human understanding, okay, in order for us to begin to get along with one another in our shared world. So this two aspects of cosmology explains art's ability to have taken the place of religion in our modernist array of cultural institutions. This specifically historical result may appear paltry when compared with its discursive and indeed almost ontological accomplishment, but then again, we must compare like models in order to adjudicate our valuing thereof. In the same vein, religion begets the church, and the Logos begets language, so the sensitivity that we are losing something of the essence when we approach the apex of any dialectic can only be matched by sensibility that the Aufhebung, in fact, preserves the relevant kernels of the questions involved. In the case of religion, it is the kerygma, and in the case of Logos, it is communication. Kerygma is just the message, the sort of kernel of the meaning in whatever revealed religion or whatever revelation there might be. For art, then, message and messenger commingle in a manner that no god who had not lived as a human could supply. And though we maintain that art is not life, nevertheless, art comes from life, just as did the ethics of the second wave of agrarian world systems, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Art can be said to be our contemporary addition thereto, or at least candidate for, such a world historical pantheon of cultural kernels. But it was Dilthey who first understood that an image also speaks. It is not a text, but yet it remains textual. And this quite apart from whether or not it has also served as a material vehicle for text proper, since many of the objects which populate such a list as we began above can also be said to be works of art, pending form and function. We have to at once be vigilant. The very problem Dilthey was himself tasked with. We are children of our own time, trying to understand those of another. Still later, the problem of cross-cultural understanding would be appended to this task, but for now, the cross-temporal issue took the cultural one as part of its given. But if instead we speak phenomenologically with Heidegger after Dilthey brings into the discussion, as we shall see in part 3 to come, Dilthey may be seen as asking after the givenness of history, which was the very thing Heidegger stated that Dilthey was not doing. Okay, we will come to that. We'll talk more about that at length anon. Suffice for the moment, though, to suggest alongside the phenomenological critique to come that historicism as historicity had grasped the essence of the problem, even if it was not able to parlay a quite equal solution to it. But what then is this givenness of history? Is it plausible to imagine that we today can understand all our yesterdays by way of interpretation alone? Dilthey argued in the affirmative, and he did so not only by extending the logic of his hermeneutic forebears, but by asking of history a slightly different kind of question than did historians themselves. At first, history was introduced as a possibility at all through a recounting of events, either lived through and thus available to mortal memory, or passed on as a matter of discursively unrelated records. Those earliest of documents that differed from the more pure testamentary sensibilities of the epic with which they commingled. In this most basic sense, history provided a narrative for mere reportage. Events could then be seen as leading to other events. And if this at first promoted a one damn thing after another mentality about history, then the hermeneut would gently steer our narrow reckoning away from relying overmuch on the data, which early historians themselves had transformed into narrative. History, in this first Diltheyan view, is the apical term in the dialectical sentence epic confronting fact uplifted into history. Okay, so epic is the thesis, fact the antithesis, and history is the synthesis. In its more plebeian formula, one could simply state that epic plus fact equals history, wherein the first term begets narrative, the second, record. History was thus its own kind of gestalt, and one utterly novel to antiquity. For Dilthey, this model of could be turned into a model for. He accomplished this admirable move by a kind of inspired substitution logic. For epic, instead, history itself, and for fact, the present day. So now we have a dialectical triangle whose bases are the thesis is history, the antithesis is now, the now, if you will, the present. So past and the present. And what then is the synthesis for Dilthey? Okay, it is a fact that we cannot travel back in time, for instance, and by our own time, history is possessed of its own epic quality, both overtaking and supplanting all proto-historical narrative and cosmogonies alike. For modernity, it is history which is both its greatest gift and its most difficult challenge, and with this second meaning of the substitution, we are already moving in the direction of our other two key figures in basic hermeneutics, that is, Martin Heidegger and Hans-Georg Gadamer. But to give Dilthey his fuller due, the idea that history, once a synthetic, could be taken for a thetic only, a thesis, and that factuality rests in the present. It has its presence by virtue of its ability to represence itself over time, to speak again, more phenomenologically for a moment, and thus confronts history with its own kind of antithesis, is nothing short of exceptional. Hermeneutics was itself moved forward with the same force and suasion as had Schleiermacher's original generalization thereof. To be fair, I am myself, because I am a phenomenologist, interpreting Dilthey rather phenomenologically. That's fine. And there will be other students who choose to stress other aspects of his analytical work. That said, equipping our interpretive toolkit with this novel dialectic, history confronting fact uplifts into historicity, allows for the conception of textuality, and thence interpretation to be generalized at another order of magnitude than did the romantic generalization of word to words accomplished by itself. Okay. Thank you for listening. We're getting sort of a taste of now the next framework, if you will. We're looking at another type of object. We're looking at image and not words, but we also need a different frame than to look at art and other kinds of image-related objects in the world, if you will. We need this frame from Wilhelm Dilthey, which is also the second part of our hermeneutic journey. See you again.